I'm getting used to the Florida statute, Your Honor. 90.704, basis of opinion testimony by experts. It's the facts or data upon which an expert bases an opinion or inference may be those perceived by or made known to the expert at or before the trial, if the facts or data are of a type reasonably relied upon by experts in the subject to support the opinion expressed. The facts or data need not be admissible in evidence. So an expert can rely on facts and data that are not admitted or not even admissible so long as those underlying facts are of a type reasonably relied upon by experts in the subject. This is a bankruptcy law professor. He teaches contracts. He teaches advanced bankruptcy, creditor-debtor rights. He's looking at these documents and giving his opinion, as per the statute, giving an opinion. And you heard from Mr. Gillen's opening, the tendency by the entirety opinion is one of the main themes of our case as to lack of motive. And the professor is going to give an opinion based on what accounts, money was protected by this doctor. And he's getting these accounts. Ms. Green is going to testify probably tomorrow, and she could testify that these were, because this was in her bailiwick as far as the bankruptcy litigation, in the regular course of business. But that's the basis for our having Professor Davis, is that he's giving his opinion based on these documents provided to him by Liz Green, kept in the regular course of her business. And as far as the hearsay objection, I believe that statute covers his ability to testify.
So you're citing the 9704, experts can testify to things that are not in evidence and can use hearsay as a basis of their opinion?
Yes.
All right. Mr. J, response?
Under 9704, an expert can certainly base his or her opinion on inadmissible evidence if that is the type of evidence that is regularly relied upon by members of the pertinent community. But that's not what's going on here. I have no problem with him talking about tenancy by the entireties and talking about the other forms of holding property, but for him to regurgitate hearsay, that's impermissible under 9704. Especially when there's authenticity issues. So that's not permissible under 9704.
Your Honor, but
hold on. What are the authenticity issues that you're raising?
Well, I mean,
I'm not familiar with the financial circumstances of the wards, so
and
I don't know what you all have seen or not seen. Yeah.
This, as I mentioned, was what I believe was provided to us in discovery about the financials. This is obviously a speck of sand on the beach.
That was provided by Mr. Kirkconnell?
As far as I can tell.
Okay.
So in particular, when it comes to life insurance, if he's going to start talking about life insurance, there's no policies, there's no terms of the contract on any of these policies. I have an Excel spreadsheet summarizing maybe, I guess, what was insurance policies on behalf of Mr. and Mrs. Ward, but not the policies themselves. No idea who prepared this spreadsheet, so I don't understand how anybody could rely upon this in any field.
Okay.
And then as far as what assets are being held in tenancy by entireties or individually by Mr. and Mrs. Ward, he can rely upon that stuff to make his opinion, but he certainly can't regurgitate it. And under 9705, not 704, I believe this court can make a decision whether or not there can be an exception to the rule that you do not get to regurgitate hearsay as an expert. But I would argue that under 9403 and the balancing factors, that it's clear that the financials were very much cherry-picked. And it's very dangerous and unfairly prejudicial for this person to start talking about some documents that were provided by the defense attorneys rather than something that was compelled by subpoena, for example. That's our objection. So it's under 9705 that experts can at times, if the court allows, as we discussed before the trial, get into regurgitating hearsay and inadmissible evidence. But in this particular situation, we're asking you to not do that because it's very, very dangerous when it's not authenticated, and it's clearly not all of them.
All right. Thank
and
you.
It wasn't compelled.
Mr. Cromwell, response.
We can assist in this, Your Honor. all the insurance information, the summary sheets, we're not go into that.
So you're not going into the life
We're
insurance?
not going to go into the life insurance. Okay. Those were summaries. The other documents, Your Honor, as far as tenancy by the entirety, we would like to go into based on, and this is a professor looking at these documents, giving his opinions based on the documents.
Can I see the documents the professor relied on? Does anybody have them? You have what was given to you. Does the professor, when is he going to be here?
He'll be here right after lunch, Your Honor.
Okay. I'd like to see the documents he was given and what he's relying upon to form his opinion prior to him taking the stand. It's a little hard for me to rule in a vacuum, having no idea what this man looked at as to whether or not it's a 704 or 705 issue. So why don't we table this discussion? I'll reserve, and I'll look at his documents and see what he looked at. All right? Sound
Thank
fair
you,
to
Your Honor.
everyone? Anything else anybody needs to put on the record as to this issue? So life insurance is not going to be inquired on. Anything else that you don't intend to inquire into that pertains to the document? I'm not asking you to tell me what your direct examination is, but
We're only going to discuss the documents pertinent to the tenancy by entirety opinion.
the houses, there were some bank accounts that were tenancy by.
Bank accounts, GenSpring account, SunTrust, basically the accounts listed in the prior testimony.
Okay, thank you. All right, any other issues this morning? All right, we're slightly ahead of schedule. Jury's not due until 9 o'clock, so. Defense? All right, have a seat, folks. Morning. Hope you all had a good evening. Did anybody see, hear, read anything about this case last night? Did anybody attempt to talk to you about the case? Did your fellow jurors behave in the jury room this morning? All right, thank you very much. Mr. Ellsworth, you may call your next witness.
Morning, Dr. Valentine.
Good morning, sir.
Would you please, for the record, state your name and spell your last name?
Yes, it's University of Arkansas College of Medicine, and I now serve as kind of a nationwide consultant in medical pharmacology and toxicology.
What did you do at the College of Medicine?
I was professor of pediatrics and pharmacology.
Okay. Can you give us an idea of your educational background?
Yes, sir. I hold bachelor's degrees both in biology and chemistry from Centenary College in Shreveport, Louisiana, and then I hold a master's and PhD in medicinal chemistry from the University of Mississippi.
What year did you graduate from the University of Mississippi?
I got my doctorate there in 1968.
Have you received any awards from the University of Mississippi?
I have.
Can you explain that to the jury?
Well, I was honored this last September to be named a distinguished alumnus of the University of Mississippi School of Pharmacy, and I received the award there that was named in honor of my mentor, Dr. Joseph Sams. It was and I was there to receive the award and gave a lecture to the present-day students there.
What was that topic of that lecture?
Well, actually, in the lecture, I talked to them about bringing science into the courtroom.
After you graduated from the University of Mississippi in 1968, can you give us your work history?
Yes, sir. Be happy to. After I left the University of Mississippi, I went to Mallinckrodt Pharmaceutical Company in St. Louis, Missouri. Was a senior research scientist there for 5 years. And then I accepted a position as an assistant professor and lecturer in medicine at the University of Missouri, Kansas City School of Medicine and School of Pharmacy. I was on the faculty there for a total of 5 years, and then I accepted a position as an associate professor of pharmacology at the Oral Roberts University School of Medicine in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I was a member of the faculty there for a total of 12 years. I was promoted to full professor while I was at the institution, and then actually served as the chairman of the Department of Pharmacology there. The last 6 years I was at that institution. When that medical school closed in 1990, my wife and I were both on the faculty there, and then we transferred to the University of Arkansas College of Medicine in Little Rock, Arkansas, and I was on the faculty there for a total of 19 years until I retired in 2008.
Thank you, Doctor. Do you hold any certifications?
Yes, sir, I do.
Could you explain what those are?
I'm board certified in clinical pharmacology, which is a discipline to how drugs are used in humans.
Have you published any book chapters?
I have.
Could you explain that?
I've published a number of chapters in books. These are usually reference books that are used in the scientific medical discipline, and the chapters that I've published generally concern the analysis of body fluids and how drugs are found in body fluids, and also the pharmacology of certain drugs.
Doctor, what is pharmacology?
Well, pharmacology is the study of the effects that drugs have on a living organism. It could be either humans or animals. I always specialized in humans, but pharmacology is also taught in veterinarian schools and pharmacy schools as well. So basically, it's the discipline involves the study of how drugs, they affect humans, either good, we hope for therapeutic effects, or sometimes the side effects that can occur with those drugs as well.
Now let's bring us to this case. Were you asked to review some materials with respect to this case?
Yes, sir, it was.
Okay. Could you tell the jury what you reviewed?
Yes, I reviewed the medical records of Ms. Ward from the Emory University School of Medicine. Then I also looked at the autopsy report, and then the toxicology results that went along with that report. In addition to that, the Wistroff laboratories over in Melbourne supplied also what's called a litigation pack, which contained their analytical procedures that they had gone through in testing the specimens from Mrs. Ward.
Now, with respect to that, have you testified in court before?
Yes, sir, I have.
Have you testified as an expert witness before?
Yes, sir.
How many times?
It's in the hundreds. I'm not sure of the times. I've got to count those up one of these days, but I've testified many, many years.
Okay. Do you testify for both the defense and the prosecution?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Doctor, what generally, and the jury's been through this, but what's citalopram?
Citalopram is a drug. It has the trade name Celexa. That's used for depression is its major use. It can be used what we call in an off-label fashion for other types of things. So basically, it works in the brain. What it does is it blocks the reuptake of a drug that's in our brain. We call a neurotransmitter. It's called serotonin, or sometimes it's called 5-HT. So it blocks the reuptake of that. A person that has depression has a lack of serotonin as this neurotransmitter in the brain, so they're not getting the same conduction across neurons that a person that does not have that deficit. And so basically this drug prevents the reuptake of the serotonin back into what we call the presynaptic cleft, and that helps the person then keep the levels of serotonin high, and so it puts them back in a normal state.
Prior to the incident, was Mrs. Ward taking citalopram?
She was.
Now, as a brief aside, what color is the pill Celexa?
Celexa it's a light pink color.
Okay. And what color is, just to be safe, what color is the generic citalopram?
It's also light pink. Now, I have to qualify that it's light pink for the 20 milligram dose, and that was the dose that she was taking.
Okay. What was her dosage?
She was being prescribed 20 milligrams to be taken 3 times a day.
Okay. Now, how would you characterize that dosage from low to high?
It's a very high dose.
Okay. Is that a dose that could still be, or that is recommended by the FDA to still be prescribed today?
Well, it could be prescribed. It would have to be done in what we call an off-label fashion. That is, the physician feels like that the patient needs that additional dose. The recommended dose, maximum dose is 40 milligrams per day.
And I believe you said she was taking 60 milligrams per day.
She was, yes, sir.
What was she being prescribed 60 milligrams a day of Celexa for?
Well, in her medical records, she had she was diagnosed as being depressed, and so she did have depression. She also had what we call OCD, the obsessive compulsive disorder. Citalopram is sometimes used for that in again what we call an off-label fashion. It's not approved for that, but it's also used for that as well sometimes.
What about anxiety?
I'm sorry?
Did she also have anxiety?
She did.
Okay. And is that something that the doctor, based upon your review of the records, that she was prescribed citalopram for?
Well, again, that's citalopram is not a good anti-anxiety drug per se, but it is used sometimes in off-label fashion for that. She was also being prescribed a small dose of Klonopin, which is was used mainly given to her to kind of offset. It was on what's called a PRN basis. She took it as she needed for anxiety.
With respect to citalopram or any other drug, what is a package insert?
Whenever a company wants to market a drug in the United States, they have to develop what's called a package insert. And there's two types of package inserts. One is designed for the physicians. They're going to be prescribing the drug. It gives all the pharmacology of the drug and talks about its uses and studies. It summarizes studies that have been done and so forth. The second is one that's designed to be in, if you were to get a bottle with a package of drugs when you go to the pharmacy, they would give you that package insert. And that's for the patients, and it's more on a lay scale. Whenever you're going to develop one of these, you have to have it approved by the Food and Drug Administration prior to marketing of the product.
Did you review the package insert for citalopram?
Yes, sir, I did.
For your testimony today?
I did.
With respect, and we'll get back to that, with respect to the autopsy toxicology findings, did Mrs. Ward have citalopram in her system at the time she passed away?
Yes, sir, she did.
Okay. What was the level of that citalopram as documented by the medical examiner's office or the lab?
It was 840 nanograms per milliliter. A nanogram is a unit of measure, so it's a very small amount. The nanogram is a very small unit.
Well, doctor, let me ask you this. Is there any way any of us can know exactly how much citalopram Mrs. Ward had in her system when she died? With an exact number?
No, sir, I don't believe so. Not an exact number.
So that 840 is a marker, but it's not an exact number.
That's correct.
Okay. What do we know about that 840 though? Was the amount of citalopram, again, if you can, low, high, or in the middle?
Well, she was receiving a high dose.
Okay. So are you comfortable saying that 840 number indicates that Mrs. Ward had a high dose of citalopram in her system when she passed away?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Not a fatal dose.
No, sir, it's not a fatal dose. If we were trying to assign a cause of death to that level, you'd be hard pressed to do so.
Okay. But at the time she died, she had a high dose, an elevated dose of citalopram.
Correct.
Okay. Did she also have alcohol in her system?
Yes, sir, she did.
Okay. Do you know what the blood alcohol level was on Mrs. Ward when she passed away?
Yes, sir, it was a 0.113 grams per deciliter.
Okay. And again, is that over the legal limit?
It is. The legal limit across the United States and Florida, as well as all over the United States, is 0.08 grams per deciliter.
Can you tell what that level of alcohol caused Mrs. Ward to act like that night of September 21st, 2009?
Well, I can't...
With any certainty?
No, sir, not with any certainty, I can't.
Okay. Can you tell with any certainty what the reaction of the citalopram was in her system with any certainty?
No, sir.
Can anybody?
No, sir, I don't believe so.
But we do know that citalopram, when taken in elevated doses, has side effects.
It does.
What are some of those side effects?
Well, if one takes a large dose of citalopram, now I have to kind of hedge this a little bit.
Sure.
Because if a person takes it for over a period of time, they have a tolerance to some of the side effects. And so, for example, some of the side effects from a higher dose once a person is put on it would be that they would be a little bit lethargic. They might have a little bit of somnolence to them. That is, be kind of dozing, sleepy just a little bit. That tends to go away after one has been on the drug for a period of time. Usually we say about 2 weeks it takes for those side effects to go away. But if, again, there's a change in the dose, if someone suddenly changes the dose, then those side effects can appear again.
Would hostility be one of those side effects?
It could be, yes.
Could aggressiveness be one of those side effects?
It could be, yes, sir.
Could anxiety be one of those side effects?
Yes, it could.
Are all of those side effects identified in the package insert?
They are.
And that's what the doctors receive and read?
Correct.
With respect to the alcohol level, understanding that we can't talk about exactly how that affected Mrs. Ward that evening, but generally speaking, with respect to that level of blood alcohol, can you say whether or not one of the side effects was loss of critical judgment?
Yes, sir. There's a table that's published by Dr. Dabowski, and it's in a lot of the text is like in medical toxicology treatise that we use quite frequently in clinical pharmacology and toxicology. And in that particular table, Dr. Dabowski gives ranges of blood alcohol levels. And certainly the ranges that are there is because people do become tolerant to alcohol. If they drink alcohol all the time, they may not have the same effects that someone else does. So there's wide ranges that are used. And so in that particular table, when you get into a blood alcohol level like that, generally you expect a person to be in kind of an excited stage.
Losing inhibitions?
Yes, the loss of inhibitions actually would occur just a little bit lower blood level than that.
And finally, doctor, I want to talk to you about the effect of a 1.1 or a 0.113 alcohol level and the 840 level of citalopram combined.
Yes, sir.
First question is, we don't know what effect the combination of the alcohol and the citalopram had on Mrs. Ward that evening.
Correct. We do not.
What are some of the effects a person may see when having over the legal limit of alcohol and an elevated dosage of citalopram?
Well, both of these drugs act on what we call the central nervous system. The central nervous system is defined as the brain and the spinal column and the nerves that radiate out from that. So alcohol causes a depression of the central nervous system. As one gets to a higher blood alcohol levels, the level goes up, you get more and more depression of the central nervous system. And what that means is that your faculties are not all there when you do that. So citalopram is also a depressant of the central nervous system. We talked about that a moment ago, is how they can occur. Excuse me. And so when you now put the two together, you've got two central nervous system depressants you're putting together, you get what's called an additive effect from those.
Doctor, that's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Ross?
Yes, ma'am.
Morning again, doctor.
Good morning, sir.
All right, you testified that you relied upon the medical records from the Emory Clinic.
Yes, sir.
And so in order for them to be a reliable source of information, they should be complete.
Yes, sir.
And if they're incomplete, then that would affect the reliability of the records that you're relying upon, correct?
I would say so, yes, sir.
Okay. And now, Ms. Ward was first prescribed this drug, Celexa or citalopram, actually back in 2005.
That's correct.
Right. And then the dosage was changed in 2007.
That's correct.
And so that's about 4 years that she had to build up taking this drug before her death.
That's correct.
And as one takes a drug continually, it builds up a level in the tissues all throughout the body, muscle, everything.
Yes,
Right?
sir.
Okay. And I believe you testified that you'd take the 20 milligrams 3 times a day, but if Dr. West testified that it was once a day that you took 20 milligrams, would you rely upon what she says over her records?
Well, all I can go by is the written record that I saw. I didn't hear her testimony.
Okay.
And in the record, she said 3 times a day.
All right, and that's your understanding of the records? Yes?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And now, to get to 840 nanograms per milliliter, approximately how many pills would that take for Mrs. Ward to get up to there, if that was her antemortem level?
I'm not confident that that was her antemortem level, okay? But to try to answer your question, I don't know. It's very difficult to say how many that she had taken.
Did you ever give a different answer to that question before?
It's possible, yes.
May I approach the witness with depositions pages 16 and 17?
You may.
Let me know if the font size is good or bad.
Oh, that's good.
All right. And if you would, just read to yourself, beginning with the question at line 10 down to the bottom of the page, and then I'll forward it to the next page for the rest of your answer. Okay? Let me know when you're ready. All right. So let me back you up and ask this now that you've had an opportunity to review that. Even though it's inexact, can you infer that it would be 4 times her normal level of dosage?
Correct. In other words, this was about 4 times what we call the therapeutic level. Correct.
And that's the top of the therapeutic level, 200?
Yes, sir.
So we can infer, although it's not exact, that your testimony would be 12 tablets instead of 3 would get her into that range if it was antemortem?
I think I said 6 tablets there.
May I approach again?
You may.
Sorry, I missed that.
No problem. I would refer you to lines 7, 8, and 9 on page 17.
Right. Okay.
So you agree with me?
Yes, sir. And of course, the next line, I did say that we couldn't be absolutely certain about it.
Absolutely. And is there any warning? You were talking about this black box warnings and other warnings in the medication. Is there anything said about citalopram and ethanol being used together?
I didn't talk about the black box warning, but the black box warning basically is a warning that's given to the physicians. It's very prominent. It's at the very first of the package insert, and it tells about any problems. There's nothing about alcohol in that black box warning.
The other warning, that's what I meant. Is there anything about interactions with ethanol?
Yes, sir.
And what does it say about that?
Well, basically, it says that use of alcohol is not recommended with citalopram.
But according to the medical records, Dr. West appeared to be well aware of Mrs. Ward's reported drinking and obviously kept prescribing Celexa to her.
That's correct. She did.
And it takes about 2 to 3 hours to get peak blood levels after taking this drug?
Yes, sir, it does.
Now, you were testifying with Mr. Ellsworth about some of the effects that can be seen with citalopram, correct?
Yes, sir.
And then in combination with trazodone and ethanol, correct?
We didn't talk about trazodone, but we were talking about
All right.
in combination with ethanol. That's correct.
And you could expect cognitive deficits,
You could, yes.
gross motor skills being affected,
It's possible at those blood levels, correct.
stumbling in speech,
Yes,
stumbling in walking,
yes,
unable to walk in a straight line,
yes, at that blood alcohol level, that's correct.
affecting one's gait or balance,
Yes, sir, possible,
fine motor skills like dexterous things with your hands,
correct.
lethargic, sleepy.
That's correct.
Would she be highly inebriated from the ethanol alone?
Well, from the, probably not. And the reason I say that is that because of her drinking pattern that was documented in the medical records, she would be somewhat tolerant to alcohol. So at a 0.13, she may not have the same effects that someone else that doesn't drink regularly would.
Do you remember giving the following answer to the following question on page 12 of your deposition, starting at line 17? Question, and not knowing Mrs. Ward, would your opinion differ any if you knew that she drank a lot on a regular basis? Answer, well, no, it really wouldn't. You're absolutely right in that a person that drinks on a regular basis, and I did see that indication in the records that I looked at, and in fact, in her medical records from memory, they talked about the fact that she does drink on a regular basis. And a person like that does handle alcohol a little bit differently than a person that would not, or that would just be having acute ingestion at night. Nonetheless, this is a substantial amount of alcohol that was found in her body, and even at that level, plus the amount of drugs that were found in her, would be enough to depress her central nervous system greatly. Do you remember giving that answer?
Yes, that's what I said, correct.
Okay. All right, now, could she perhaps even have trouble standing on her own at those levels of citalopram, ethanol, and trazodone?
It's possible.
Very poor hand-eye coordination?
It's possible.
And it would be as though she was moving in slow motion?
It's possible.
No other questions?
Redirect. Names, witnesses, you. Jay?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, thank you, Dr. Here you go. Call your next witness. Is your mic on? Good name, Mark.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning.
Morning.
Would you please state your name for the record and spell your last name?
My name is Nancy Whitney Peterson, Peterson.
Ms. Peterson, what's your occupation?
Right now I'm the owner of Forensic Biology Consultants, and in that work that I do is I do independent I'm sorry.
Take your time.
I do.
Take your time.
This
That's
is
okay.
loud. I'm going to sit back a little bit. I do independent case file reviews of cases that were DNA cases that were done in crime laboratories, both public and private. I also give seminars and training for attorneys and law enforcement personnel. And during the week, or when I'm working, I also I also read a number of journals, look at a number of papers, and go to meetings, and I have personal one-on-one discussions with the people in the field that are doing casework.
Okay. So let's talk about your educational background.
Okay.
Where'd you go to college?
I went to Florida State University, where I earned a major in biology and a minor in chemistry.
And what'd you do after that?
Well, right after that, I got a job in a research laboratory at FSU, and I was there for 5 years. During that time, I co-authored 5 papers with the professor I worked for in transport of molecules down nerves, essentially.
Where did you go next?
Then I was hired by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement in 1978, and in that I was there for 20 years. And the first year I was there, I had a full year-long training program which covered the testing materials, the background on all the tests we were going to use to test the materials that we had, a lot of intensive reading and coursework, and we also did tests and mock trials, and then I worked independently on cases for 20 19 years.
Okay, so I want to talk about FDLE for a second.
Okay.
In basic terms, in lay terms that I can understand, what did you do at FDLE?
Essentially what I did at FDLE was, once I was trained in all the techniques that we use, is we would get evidence in from various police departments and sheriff's office. They would bring evidence to the front of the lab, and it would get marked and labeled and then put into the vault. And when I got the case file, I would go down and get the evidence and start examining the evidence one item at a time, and over butcher paper. And
Well, I think we missed a
that's too
step.
detailed.
What are you testing the evidence for?
I would be testing the evidence for the presence of blood, semen, saliva, and occasionally skin cells on, say, baseball hats.
Is there an acronym for what you were doing for testing? Is it DNA?
Oh, yeah, well, I did DNA and classical serology, but yes, I did DNA in the last 5 years that I was there.
Okay. So tell us what DNA testing is. And if you can, slowly.
Okay. When you're using DNA in a forensic setting, the first thing that you do is find some appropriate stains on the item of evidence, and then you cut a small portion of that stain out, and it will have cells on it, blood cells, semen, skin cells, and then you need to remove those cells from the fabric. So you just cut a little piece, you either use a swab and wipe the stain, or you cut a small piece of it and put it in a small tube. And from that point on, you're removing the DNA from the item, purifying the DNA, determining how much DNA you have present, and then running the test for the specific types of DNA.
Okay. How many DNA tests have you performed over your career?
At FDLE, probably around 2,000 or so, 2,000 to 3,000.
Do the labs you work in need to be accredited?
My lab?
Yeah.
Well, I don't have a lab.
Well, do labs that people, Miss Vita, for example, are you familiar with Miss Vita?
Right, yes.
Is her lab required to be accredited?
Right, yes. Any crime laboratory doing DNA testing has to be accredited, and crime laboratories in general have to be accredited also.
Do you do any of those accreditations?
Yes, at one point in time, I was hired or recruited by the National, let me get their name right, the National Forensic Science Technology Center, NFSTC. When I was at a meeting, I had retired from FDLE, and so they recruited me to do audits on DNA labs. And every DNA lab has to be audited at least once a year or every other year. Just depends on what they're doing. And
Okay,
in that job,
apologize, continue, sorry.
okay. In that job, I also, my part of the job was to do case file reviews of the DNA cases that they had worked in the lab, compare that, what they did and the interpretations they made on their standard operating procedures. The standard operating procedure, which is, we shortened to SOP, is a document that has all the rules involved in both analyzing the evidence and then when you get the DNA profile, how to interpret the DNA profile. And I probably did, I want to say about 2,000 of those case files also over a 4-year time frame.
Did there ever come a time when you were called upon to set something similar up in another country?
Yes, I was also recruited at another forensic DNA meeting I went to by the Department of Justice. And once again, it's because I had actually retired so I could go somewhere. And they hired me through the United Nations to go to Pristina, Kosovo, which is just north of Greece in the Balkans. And while I was there, I spent about 14 months over a two-year time frame going to the lab, setting the lab up. When I got there, the instruments were there, but nothing else, none of the test tubes or anything. And there were 5 people that I was training. And so we got the lab all set up with everything that they need to do, and then I showed them how to look at evidence, how to remove stains, and then go through the DNA process.
I think you said the Department of Justice. Is that the United States Department of Justice that
Right.
you were referring to?
Right,
Okay, and they're the ones that asked you to go over and do that?
right,
Okay.
exactly.
Let's talk about this case. Did you review some materials for your involvement in this case?
Yes.
I mean, tell the jury what you reviewed.
I got the DNA case file from the laboratory along with their standard operating procedures, and I looked through the case file to determine
Just what you reviewed, that's all we're asking. Just the materials you reviewed.
the case file.
Yeah.
And the DNA electropherograms that were produced.
Okay. Did the lab test DNA on items from the Ward household?
Yes.
What items?
Let me get it out here. There were some clothing items and a gun.
Okay, so a shirt, right?
Right.
Shorts,
Yes.
and then a gun.
Yes.
Okay,
I think there's a shoe also.
okay. Shorts, shirt, shoe, gun. Let's talk about the gun. How many different samples were taken from the gun?
On the gun itself, the lab received 2 samples,
Okay.
or 3 samples rather, from the gun.
Well, did they receive, how many different packages did they receive from the scene?
Right. Each of the 3 samples had been collected separately. One was from the inside barrel of the gun, and that was collected with a cotton tip swab and packaged in an individual package. And then there was 2 cotton tip swabs that were used to clean the trigger of the gun, and then 2 additional cotton tip swabs that were used to clean the or collect evidence from the grip of the gun. And each one was packaged separately.
You just stole my next question. Were each of these items packaged separately?
Yes.
What does that mean?
When you get items packaged separately from, especially from the crime scene unit, you or I would open those items individually and run the tests on them individually, because if they're separately packaged by the agency, that means they want to look at each item separately. And so you would have 3 sets of tubes instead of 2.
Did the lab, and you're aware that it was Miss Vita who did the testing, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Did Miss Vita have standard operating procedures that addressed the issue of separate packages being sent to be tested?
Yes, in the standard operating procedures, there is a document, a rule that when items come in packaged separately, you examine them separately.
Is that what happened here?
No.
What happened here?
She combined the swabs from the trigger and the swabs from the grip into one tube for analysis.
Okay. Why did she do that?
She made notes that there would be insufficient DNA possibly on the trigger or on the gun grip, so she combined the samples to maximize the possibility of picking up DNA from those 2 areas.
Given that the samples were combined, can we ever know whether or not can we know for certain whose DNA was on the trigger?
No.
Can we know for certain whose DNA was on the grip?
No.
Well, let's talk about what we do know, or what we can know after the samples were combined. There are some things we can still find out, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so tell us about what you did or what you reviewed with regard to the testing of the gun after the samples were combined.
I reviewed the process that she used to extract or remove the DNA, then purify the DNA. And I went through the whole process of going from a sample to a DNA. It's called an electropherogram, but it's essentially a picture of what the DNA looks like, or it's pictures that represent how much DNA you have on a sample. And the whole process she used was done properly, removing the DNA and getting the final picture.
Okay, so prior to testing, or at the same time of testing, you received a buccal swab from Mr. Ward? Or the lab received, I should say, a buccal swab from Mr. Ward?
From where?
Mr. Ward's mouth?
Oh, Mr. Ward, yes.
Okay, what was the purpose of that?
Buccal swabs or samples of blood, which aren't used very often anymore, are known as standards, and they're samples that you know who they came from, what individual they came from, and then you compare the DNA profile of that sample to any of the samples from the crime scene.
Okay, so before we test to see whose DNA is or isn't on the gun, we have to have Mr. Ward's DNA, and we do,
Right,
and we have a sample of Mrs. Ward's DNA.
right,
So we know that this is Mr. Ward's DNA and this is Mrs. Ward's DNA.
Right.
Now let's look at the gun.
right.
What do we find on the gun?
Well, what you find on the gun, when I looked at the DNA profiles from the gun, the first thing I do is look at the whole profile. There are 13 areas that were tested for, and determine whether or not it's single source or a mixed sample. In this case, it was a mixture sample, so then I try to make a determination of whose blood might be in that mixture.
Okay. Were you able to come to any conclusions based on your scientific testing and review of scientific testing about whose DNA was on the gun?
Yes,
Okay. Was Mr. Ward's DNA on the gun?
yes.
Okay, how do you know?
Well, there was a major minor. When you have a mixture, most of the time you're not going to get the same amount of DNA placed on an item by two people. One person will have put more DNA on there or left more DNA. The second person may have left smaller amount. And that's what happened in this case. There was a major profile where the DNA peaks on the electrogram were much higher than the second person's peaks. So I could tell the major peaks all were consistent with Mr. Ward.
So within a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, was Mr. Ward's DNA on the gun?
Yes,
But we don't know whether or not it was on the grip or the trigger
that's correct.
because the samples were combined
Right,
by Ms. Vita.
right.
Okay. What about Mrs. Ward? Was Mrs. Ward's DNA on the gun?
Yes, hers was the minor profile in the picture, and so her DNA didn't show up at every single site that was tested, but it showed up on 9 sites.
Okay, so based upon your years of experience and your scientific training, can you tell this jury, based on a reasonable degree of scientific probability, was Mrs. Ward's DNA on that gun?
Yes,
Your Honor, permission to approach the witness with what's been admitted as State's Exhibit 22.
Granted.
I'm going to grab a glove.
Box should be there. Oh, they moved it.
Ah, could have bit me. I think I need some of the larger gloves.
We've switched the boxes for some reason.
Thank you. Ms. Vita, I'm going to hand you, as soon as I put this glove on, what's been marked as State's boy, you don't know how fat your hands are until you.
yeah, well,
State's Exhibit 22. What is this? Do you know?
it's some kind of a holder.
Okay. Let me ask you this question. Could we get a DNA sample off that holster or off that item?
Yes,
Is there any reason why someone would say, we don't need to test that because there's no way we could get any DNA off that?
you can't say that till you actually run a test, because the only time DNA, a stain is visible is if it's a blood stain, sometimes a saliva stain. Other than that, you really just need to run the tests. You can't just look at something and say there's not going to be any DNA on there, especially with this surface. It's kind of spongy, and so I would think that if somebody was handling it a lot, you'd be able to get something off of it, but maybe not. But the bottom line is that you can't just arbitrarily say you're not going to test it because there won't be any DNA.
Did you receive any information that this item was tested for DNA?
No.
Thank you, ma'am. That's all the questions I have.
Cross.
Yes, ma'am. Sorry. All right, so back in 2009, 2010, FDLE was using 2 different commercial kits, correct?
Yes, it looked like that.
You weren't working at FDLE though, right?
No,
All right, but according to the records you reviewed, it was profiler and co-filer, correct?
right,
And between the 2 of them, you could test for 13 markers plus the sex marker amylogenin.
right,
All right, so, and the standard injection time at that time was 10 seconds.
right,
And in order to include somebody in a potential profile, they had to meet at least 100 RFUs, correct?
right.
And in order to exclude somebody from a profile, it would have to be at least 50 to 100, correct?
Yeah, well, yes.
Well, what does the FDLE SOP say, ma'am?
Well, if it's between 50 RFUs and 100 RFU, which are light units, the DNA in that range is very small amount of DNA. And so if you have enough DNA at all the loci, you may be able to exclude somebody. I believe it says you have to exclude someone, it has to be excluded at least 3 loci. You can't have it just at 1.
Okay. All right, and so this DNA sample that we're talking about, Q4, Q5, the swabs from the trigger and the gun,
Right.
that was done at 10 seconds? Correct?
Well, it was done at 10 and 22.
And then at 22 seconds,
Right.
correct? And the reason it was done at 22 seconds was because there were things that were unreportable because they were under 100 RFUs under the 10-second injection, right?
Right.
Okay. Now, in the DNA results on Q4 and Q5, there were actually DNA results that didn't belong to Mr. or Mrs. Ward on there, correct?
Right. There were a few extra alleles that were from an additional person.
A few? So that's
There
3?
weren't very many extra. 3.
Well, you said a few. I'm just making sure a few means 3 or more.
1, 2, 3, 4. There were
Okay.
4.
And so, therefore, that person under what you were saying, I believe you said 3 locations, you should be able to call it as a minor profile, right?
I said 4 locations.
All right.
And
So,
those were 55, 71. There was only 1 that was over 100. The others were under 100, and so you normally don't call that as part of a profile.
we'll get to those. So, would you say from those DNA results that there were 3 people holding the gun at the time that it went off?
No, you can't say that about holding the gun at the time. The DNA on the gun is going to be on the gun from the time it was placed on there till the time it's removed. Because there's 2 or even 3 people doesn't mean they were all handling the gun at the same time. They could have been, but that doesn't mean it definitely was.
So, to whatever extent Mrs. Ward DNA profile is on that gun, that doesn't tell you that she was handling the gun at the time it was discharged and hit her, right?
No.
And she lived in this house, correct?
Yes.
And DNA can be transferred from one place to another by another person or another thing, right?
Can be, yes.
And it can be projected, such as coughing, sneezing, so on and so forth?
Yes.
Okay. Now let's talk about location by location, starting with D3 at the 10 seconds. Are you ready to do that? Do you have the chart in front of you?
I have the 22-second one, which brought up better profiles, but I probably have the 10 in here. There we go. Okay. Yeah, I have the 10-second.
Okay. And Mrs. Ward was a 16-18 there?
She is a 16-18, yes.
And at 10 seconds, the 16 didn't meet the requirements of being 100 RFUs, correct?
That's correct.
And then after being amplified, the 16 at 22 seconds was around 200?
Yes.
All right. And is there some sort of percentage between 2 peaks that they must fall within before you can say they belong to the same person?
They must be within 60% or more.
Okay. And so Mr. Ward happened to be a 1518 there, correct?
Correct.
And in looking at the 18 in the relationship to the 15, was that within the requirements of 60% or higher?
It looks like it.
So therefore, you can't conclude that Mrs. Ward had any contribution to the 18 at that location, correct?
No, that's not correct.
It's not correct?
No.
Okay. Now let's look at FGA location.
Okay.
Even at the 22-second injection, Mrs. Ward's 22 doesn't meet the requirements of 100 RFUs, correct?
Correct.
And there's a 25 there that could either be part of an 1825 person or a 2225 person, correct?
Or a 21, 20,
Correct.
25.
And the ratio of the defendant's two peaks there is around 66%?
Oh, I didn't do the math on them because I visually looked at them,
Okay.
but that's fine.
Now at D8S, are you ready?
Which one?
D8S?
D8? Are you talking about?
D8S 1179?
Right, that's D8 as in,
All right. And so Mrs. Ward's 15 there, even at the 22-second injection, doesn't meet 100 RFUs, correct?
correct,
It's 56, correct?
correct. That's correct,
And her 11 doesn't even show up at the 22-second injection, correct?
correct,
And some unknown person there is showing up at 10 there on the 22-second injection?
correct,
And that unknown person at 10 is 55 RFUs, correct?
correct,
So that's within 1/56th of the 15 that showed up there, correct?
correct,
So can't even really say, I mean, obviously can't say that she's included because it's not 100 RFU, but that could be somebody that's a 10-15 there, correct?
correct.
At D5S 818,
Yes,
at the 22-second injection, Mrs. Ward's 9 is still not showing up, correct?
correct,
And she was a 912 there?
yes,
So obviously, whatever is there at 12, you can't divide by 0 to do that 60% ratio, right?
right,
D13S317,
yes,
at the 22-second injection, Mrs. Ward's 11 is still under the 100 RFUs, correct?
right,
And at the 22-second injection, her 10 is just barely there at 101, correct? And at the last one, CSF 1PO or 1P0, I'm not sure.
right,
Even at 22 seconds, Mrs. Ward's 12 doesn't show up, correct?
right. It's just Mr. Ward's.
And she's at 12-12 there, so she's got double the bang for her buck from mom and dad, right?
Right, but when it's a low-level sample like that, and the CSFIPO, or chromosome number 5, you have something called allelic dropout, meaning that if there's a small, and also degradation of the DNA, so when DNA in that larger range, there's larger pieces of DNA in that particular chromosome, and those can be degraded down, so you might not get the minor profile, especially in a case where the minor profile is fairly low anyway.
And so you said she showed up at 9 locations?
Yes.
And is that at over 100 RFUs at the 22 second?
No, each one of them would need to be discussed separately, but I did get a match to her on 3 loci where his DNA was there and her DNA was there over 100 RFUs. And then on the others, she could be included because one of her alleles or DNA types is visible. The second one is she has the same type as he does, and so you can't exclude her because her 8 could be, say, I'm just making up a number now, her 8 could be mixed with his 8. And so, and then you have her separate allele. So those are called included. And
But
then
even
there
at
were
all
several
those-
that were inconclusive or she wasn't included. But that's not unexpected when you have a low-level sample coming in, because there's physical things that go on when you test the DNA. You have to amplify it, increase the amount. And if you have the second person has a lot less DNA than the first person, the smaller one doesn't always amplify as well. But sometimes it does. You just have to run the tests and see what you get.
All right, so you've said a few times here that this is a low-level sample for Mrs. Ward, correct?
Right.
And
She
that
did
it
have
called for
a-
yes or no?
Yes.
If you want to explain, Mr. Ellsworth will be able to help you with that. All right. And so you were briefly explaining touch DNA, correct?
Right.
And touch DNA is just when somebody touches a surface, they can or they may not leave some of their DNA behind, correct?
Touch DNA is probably the wrong word because it would also apply to really small amounts of blood or saliva or something else, not specifically touch. For example, I've been so close to this microphone that if you swabbed it, you would probably get some of my DNA off of it just from me talking. And when you talk, some saliva will come out of your mouth. So touch isn't only touching something.
Okay. And so if
From the
Mrs.
third
Ward
user.
gets shot in the face, unfortunately, about a foot away from the gun, her saliva could have ended up on that gun, correct?
Yes.
And that would not test positive for blood. There's a different test for that, right?
Well, nothing was tested. No, it was not tested for the type of body fluid.
Okay.
But yeah, if it's saliva, it's not going to test for blood. It would test for saliva.
All right. So anyways, let's going back to touch DNA or transfer DNA, however you want to call it. But every time you touch something, you're not necessarily leaving nuclear DNA behind from your epithelial cells, right?
Correct.
Some people are better at doing that, if that's the way you would describe it, and some people don't do it as much, correct?
Right. It's called shedding. Some people shed their DNA more than other people do.
All right. And also the surface that is being touched, if it is to be touch DNA, does that affect it as well, whether it's smooth or rough?
Yes.
And obviously a rougher surface would be better for getting DNA than a smooth surface, correct?
Yeah. It just depends. If you're trying to get DNA off a rock, which is a rough surface, you're not going to have all that much luck. Whereas if you put the same amount of DNA on a solid surface, you might be able to pick it up.
All right. Aside from the porous nature of some rocks, let's talk about guns. So you would agree that a trigger is a smooth metal surface, correct?
Yes.
And the grip, and if you need to see the gun again, that's fine. I can help you with that. The grip is not a smooth surface, correct?
Correct.
And the surface area of the trigger is pretty small compared to the surface area of the grip, correct?
Correct.
And obviously with the whole idea of this smoothness versus roughness is this force of nature called friction, right?
Right.
And the force of friction, if somebody rubs their hands together really hard, even if my hands aren't metal, I could probably generate some touch DNA if I do it enough, right? And so would you agree that the firing of a firearm, if you're holding onto the grip, that would be an event that causes friction, if you're going to hold onto the gun and not drop it?
Yes.
Okay. And are you aware of how to fire a gun without holding the grip?
I don't fire guns. I've only handled them in the lab to collect samples, but I have never owned a gun and never tried to fire one.
Now, regardless of what SOPs call for procedurally with any bureaucratic agency, isn't what's really important scientific reliability?
Yes.
Now, in what year did you leave FDLE?
1998.
And you testified on direct about your experience of doing your own DNA testing, correct?
I don't do testing. I review case files. I essentially audit the
Excuse me.
case files like I did before.
When you worked at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, during your direct examination with Mr. Ellsworth, you talked about your own DNA work while you were there, correct?
Right, that's correct.
All right. Now, was that PCR DNA testing?
No, at the time it was a different type. It was the very first type of DNA testing that came out, RFLP, and I was trained in that. And that's what I did until the time I retired.
Did you actually ever do any casework, front lines, down in the trenches, PCR, DNA analysis?
Not at that point, because I was still in training for PCR analysis, because it was a much better process than what I was doing. So the crime labs were going to switch over, and I was getting preliminary training in that technology.
Did you do any independent casework using PCR DNA testing?
No.
Thank you.
Redirect.
A lot of numbers, a lot of alphabet, a lot of everything that you were just asked. Let me ask you one last question. Was Mrs. Ward's DNA on that gun?
Yes, there was a sufficient amount of her DNA at some of the locations in the chromosomes for me to be able to say that her blood was on that, her DNA was on that gun.
Thank you.
May this witness be excused.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you. You're free to go. Ms. Peterson, you're free to go.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Thank you. Jurors, how you holding up? You need a break? No? You do? All right. Why don't we take a quick 10-minute break? All right, let's bring the jury back in. State recognized presence of the jury.
Yes, Your Honor.
Defense?
Yes, Your Honor.
Have a seat, everyone. Mr. Gillen, you may call your next witness.
Defense calls Gerald Stiers. I do.
You may inquire.
State your name for the record, and please, if you would, spell your name for the court reporter.
My first name is Gerald, that's Gerald. Last name is Stiers, spelled Styers.
Now, where do you live, Mr. Stiers?
In the state of Pennsylvania.
What do you do for a living?
I'm a forensic consultant.
As part of what you do as a forensic consultant, do you analyze and render opinions regarding distance in stippling testing or gunshots involving stippling on either clothing or on human beings?
Yes, sir.
Now, I want to ask you a couple of preliminary questions, and then I'm going to get into your background. Is this distance determination based on stippling review and stippling testing, is it an exact science?
No, sir.
Are you able at any point to give anyone an exact distance from the end of the muzzle to whatever the target might be that you're studying?
No, sir, you can't. The only time you'll be able to do that if you have a contact or near contact shot to the item.
Is this sort of analysis and opinion based principally on experience and training?
That's correct, sir.
Well, I want to ask, that's a lead in to, I'm going to get in, it's going to take a while, but I want to go over your experience and your training, and then we're going to ask you questions about what specifically you did in this case, okay?
Yes, sir.
Now, tell us a little bit about your law enforcement background. When did you get started?
I started in September of 1961.
And where were you working then?
After graduation from the academy, I was stationed in Greensburg, Pennsylvania.
What did you do there for the police in Pennsylvania?
I did traffic investigations first, then I got transferred into the criminal investigation end.
Was that in 1967?
It was in 1966. I was
Okay.
in the Criminal Investigation Division.
What did you do there in the criminal investigation section in at the Pennsylvania State Police?
There at I'm stationed in Greensburg is involving investigating homicides, burglary, rapes, those type of incidents.
In doing that, did you have occasion in that earlier phase of your career to examine any types of firearms and fired bullets or cartridge cases?
Not then. It wasn't until 1967 I was transferred and assigned to the crime laboratory in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, as a trainee from 1967 to 1969.
All right, well, let's focus on that. 1967, 1969, what did you do there at the crime lab?
At that time, it was involving learning the examination of bullets, firearms, and also fired cartridge cases. And the objective there was to identify whether a bullet or cartridge case was fired by a particular firearm. Also involving tool mark identification is where you have a pry bar, tire iron, screwdriver, any instruments used to cut, pry, or twist something. You can take those markings left upon that object and compare them with the tool itself. Also involving examination of clothing and other items for gunpowder residue patterns.
Does that involve any kind of analysis of the distance between the end of the muzzle of a gun and wherever the targeted area might have been?
That's correct.
Now, after there come a time when you left the Pennsylvania State Police.
That's correct, sir.
And when was that, and where did you go?
I retired in 1986. And then in April of 1987, I started at the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, where I set up the crime lab, the firearms identification section for the crime lab there in Palm Beach County.
That's here in Florida?
That is correct.
Now, when you say that you were in charge of setting up the forensics or the lab, tell us a little bit about what you're doing, what your responsibilities were.
Well, in the firearms identification section, purchasing equipment, setting up the facility as far as ammunition to do searching on, and various other duties.
Now, part of that work that you did for the Palm Beach County, did that involve distance determination?
Yes, I worked cases which involved determining the distance between a muzzle of a firearm and the object fired upon.
How long did you work down there in Palm Beach?
Approximately 2 years.
After Palm Beach, where did you go next?
I was invited to participate in a project at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. It was involving starting in '89 and also continuing in 1990, involving examination of solved cases that occurred within the Washington, D.C. area.
Now, how long did you work there at the FBI Academy?
It was in about 5 months in 1989, another 5 months in 1990.
Did part of that involve also some analysis of distance determination?
Yes, sir, it was.
After your contract with the FBI there at Quantico, what did you do next?
I went to the under contract with the LAPD, Los Angeles Police Department in LA, where I worked cases involving there and also assisted in the training of new personnel.
When you said you had assisted in training new personnel, what were you assisting them in? Tell us what you were teaching the new personnel out there in Los Angeles.
It'd be involving the examination of firearms, bullets, and cartridge cases, also distance determination.
Now, how long were you out in Los Angeles?
2 years.
Traveling all over the country. Are we going again to a new place after LA?
Yes,
Where do you go?
to the Prince George's County Police Department located in Maryland.
And what did you do there?
There I also had the responsibility of setting up the firearms identification section, and training of 3 new individuals in that area, which included, I also worked cases there involving firearm identification and also distance determination.
Now, did you indicate that, what year that was?
That was from 1994 to 96.
Okay. About this time in the 93-94 period, I'll ask you whether or not you took any leadership role in any national or international organizations dealing with firearms analysis, including but not limited to distance determinations.
In that year, I became the president for the Association of Firearms and Tool Mark Examiners, which is a association throughout the world where we hold annual conferences involving technical information is disseminated to all the examiners throughout the world who may attend.
So your role there was president?
I was the president for that year.
And was that a 1 or 2 year term that you had for being president of the International Association?
It's 1 year term.
That was during the period of time that you were there at Prince George's County?
That's correct, sir.
Now, I'll ask you in June of 1999 whether you came back to Florida and did any work here in Florida in this area.
Yes, I did.
Tell us about that, please.
I started the firearm identification section at Fort Myers lab, where I had the responsibility of examining physical evidence and also distance determination cases, and also assisted in training of new people.
How long did you stay there with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement?
It wasn't quite 2 years.
When you were there, were you trained, or did you train individuals and personnel in, among other things, the analysis of distance determination?
Yes, sir.
And when did you leave the Florida Department of Law Enforcement?
I left there in 2001.
Now, you leave in 2000, 2001. Do you take another trip to another part of the country, or what?
Yes, I received a call from persons who I know works with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department in Los Angeles County, and asked if I'd be interested in coming there and doing training. And so I did take up the contract and worked there for 8 years under contract.
Now, did you ever work, or were you ever selected while you were at Prince George's County? Were you asked to review cases by the Department of Justice at the FBI Academy?
Yes, I was contacted by the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. To serve as the administrator, to work on cases that are unsolved within the Washington, D.C. area again, where I retained under contract 11 examiners to examine this physical evidence, and where they examined 2,240 cases in 9 months. And I had the responsibility of setting it up, reviewing cases with them, and organizing and running the whole project.
Did you have anyone that you either trained or that you supervised there as you were working in that role for the Department of Justice?
Yes, there was. The 3 individuals training at the Prince George's County Police Department came with me down to Quantico and worked alongside other examiners there, and also with me. I had training sessions at nighttime with those individuals.
And then you mentioned after that you went back out to Los Angeles?
That's correct, sir.
And again, briefly, your role there was what?
There was involved in training of individuals and training the people and following the training syllabus as outlined by our association. And also I worked some cases involving identification of bullets and cartridge cases, and also distance determination. And also did a lot of case reviews.
Now, you've told us a lot about your travels and how you taught other people. I'd like to ask you whether or not you had ever received training yourself at the FBI Academy.
I did on 2 different occasions. The first was in 1976, where I attended a 1-week course on gunpowder residue and primer residue testing and interpretation.
Have you, in addition to training people and receiving it, training yourself, ever taught at any academies or seminars for law enforcement?
I taught at our academy for the State Police Academy for years. I'd say at least 20 years almost. And I've taught and trained people from different police departments like Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, New York, Ohio, that came to our lab for additional training in Pennsylvania. And I also went to Amman, Jordan, where I trained people over there in Amman, Jordan.
In addition to the training that you received, that you have described to us through the law enforcement community, did you ever, in order to further understand and gain additional expertise in your area, did you ever go to actual factories where they were manufacturing guns or ammunition?
I have gone to numerous firearms manufacturing and also ammunition.
Why do you go there? What are you going to learn there?
Well, you're going to see how a particular item is made. Involving a firearm, you'll see how the barrels are produced, how the firing pins are produced, how the overall operation concern is done in production of a firearm. Also, the ammunition itself. The ammunition, you look and see what kind of procedures they go through to produce ammunition at the factories.
Okay. Now, have you ever testified in court regarding distance determinations?
I have, sir.
About how many times would you speculate or conclude, or estimate, really is a better word, how many times would you estimate that you have testified regarding distance determinations?
I'd say it was less than 100 times.
Okay. Now, we've gone through your background. Let's move to what you did in this case, okay?
Yes, sir.
Did there come a time in which you went came down to make a visit to analyze some evidence in this case?
I did, sir.
And where did you go to analyze the evidence, and what did you analyze?
I went to the evidence area, somewhere here in Orlando, I think it was, to look at testifiers that were produced on 12-gene cloth.
What was the purpose or the objective of your coming and being involved in the analysis of the evidence?
To examine the 12-gene cloths visually, and also with a small magnifying glass, to record the pattern of the residue, gunpowder residue around the hole of entrance, do a measurement of that residue, look at the density of the gunpowder residue pattern, so that I could later then compare it with the pattern on the victim's face.
So you had a photograph of Mrs. Ward's face.
That's correct.
Now, when you saw the photograph of Mrs. Ward's face, then you made some comparison with the cotton twills. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Now, as it relates to the photograph of Mrs. Ward's face, did you make some sort of determination in terms of looking at it about some sort of discernible pattern that you could see on her face?
What I went by mainly was the height of the pattern residue from this area approximately down this area, which to be measured about 6 inches, and also looking at the density of it.
Now, I want to ask you a little bit about that. When you say that you were looking at the height of what? Tell us what you are looking at in the photograph.
This would be the red marks that are produced upon from the gunpowder itself, which could be unburned powder or partially burnt powder, which strikes the skin itself and it leaves a red type marking. And I measured those areas.
Now, the measurement on Mrs. Ward's face, when you're trying to tell us, are you able to measure the height and the width of a pattern, or are you limited in some way to make a determination about either the height or the width?
What I use is exclude any flyers you have, flying out at the side of the firing itself. So you may have a strike up here, strike here, but the pattern would be consistent, be in an area around the hole of entrance. You don't include the flyers themselves,
Well,
because they can change so rapidly.
you mentioned the term flyers, and you need to explain to the jury what you mean when you use the term flyers in the context of how you go about your making your determination and rendering your professional opinion.
Like I said, if I had flyer here and a mark here and a mark here and some down here in the bottom, and they're very separated, the spatial relationship is very wide, or maybe just 2 or 3 there, I would go with a more concentrated area, which would be your true pattern. And then I'd measure that pattern to see what the height is.
How can a flyer be produced such that it's not within the pattern group of the other marks of the stippling?
Well, it can occur by the barrel length of a firearm itself. This being a 1 3/4 inch firearm, you have a lot of gases coming out of there in a very short distance. So that can cause the gas and propel to throw that powder very quickly onto its target. And that's why you can get flyers around the hole of entrance.
So what you're endeavoring to do is to find a pattern in the photograph of Mrs. Ward's face, correct?
That's correct, sir.
And then you're going to be doing an analysis comparing that photograph with your physical analysis of the cotton twills?
That's correct, sir.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that this particular gun had a short barrel, correct?
That's correct, sir.
And what type of, this was a 357, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, is a 357 ammunition going to create more explosive or more powder?
Yes, it's a more powerful caliber in 38 caliber. It's called a 357 Magnum. The cartridge case is longer than a 38 Special, so you can load more powder into that to get more velocity.
When you're looking at the different pattern, are there a number of factors that come into play in terms of what might have an impact on the pattern on Mrs. Ward's face vis-a-vis the analysis of a pattern on a cotton twill?
Yes, sir.
Does the primer in the expended cartridge have any impact whatsoever on your analysis that you may do?
It can affect the size of the pattern and also the density.
How could it do so?
If you have poor ignition from the primer itself trying to ignite the powder, it may not throw it as hard or fast to the object it's going to strike, and of course you're going to have the indentation or the red marks upon the surface of skin.
Now, when you're making an analysis about a comparison between what happened with one particular cartridge, are all primers equally? Do they work equally in a particular cartridge on all of the ammo that might even be in the same box?
Well, they're designed to do that, but sometimes they don't do that.
Okay. And what about the chemical composition of the gunpowder itself? Is that always consistent between the cartridges of a particular ammo, in this case for the 357?
No, they'll vary in weight. The powder charge itself, that's the amount of powder that's placed into the cartridge case itself. If you take a box of ammunition and you pull all those rounds out, you'll find they all have some weight differences between all of them.
Well, what impact would that have on the pattern that you might observe in terms of analyzing the photograph of Mrs. Ward's face with the test cotton twill sheet cloths?
It could possibly affect the pattern size and density.
Is that one of the variables that you have to consider?
That's correct.
What about is there the same burn rate? Or what is the burn rate, and what variable might that play in a pattern analysis?
Well, the burning rate can be affected by the powder morphology itself. Powders are made in different forms. They're made in ball-type powder, flattened ball, cracked ball, tuber-type powder, and we have flake or disc powder. And that can affect the burning rate if it's not, because manufacturers, when they do manufacture powder and place it into a cartridge they were designing and making, they may have a lot of powder they'll use, okay, because they know that a lot of powder produces the pressures they need and the velocities they need for that cartridge case. Now, if they run out of that, they've got to produce another lot of powder, and that can change from the weight and everything else because it can all change in their manufacturing.
So is it fair to say there are a number of different variables that could alter a pattern on the cloth twill as opposed to the pattern which you saw on Mrs. Ward's face?
It could, yes, sir.
Now, when you started testifying a moment ago, you discussed how the difficulty in coming up with an exact distance, correct?
As far as an exact distance, no, you cannot come with exact distance. You always have to bracket something. Say it's greater than 2 inches and less than 8 inches or 12 inches.
And why do you have to have that bracket when you're, after all of the, you've been doing this since, what, 1967, is it's always been the case that there's this bracket of kind of almost, there's an uncertainty and you have to bracket your opinion?
Because of these variables you're not aware of.
Now, why don't you walk us through, or begin walking us through what you physically did? You looked at the photograph of Mrs. Ward's face, correct?
That's correct, sir.
And what did you do when you went to examine the test done by the government?
I looked at the evidence visually, and then I used a magnifying glass to see if I can see. I couldn't see visibly, and then I recorded the size of the pattern was recorded on the twill jean cloth on each one of the shots that were fired at 6 inches, 12 inches, 18 inches, 24 and 30 inches.
I'm going to show you what has been introduced into evidence. I don't need the gloves for this because it's inside a little container. Oh, no, it was up. Oh, here it is. I believe this is Exhibit 42. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Thank you. Show you what's been admitted into evidence as as States 42. Does this appear to be the cotton twills that you analyzed when you went down to the State's evidence room?
Yes, sir, it does. Yes, sir, it does.
Now, just a layman's question. There appears to be here, this is, I'm pointing here, and this will go out with the jury, so I just have to show it to you. This is the entry where the test bullet went in?
That's correct, sir.
There seems to be a lot more of the stippling just north of that. Is that a fair assessment?
There's a larger number of residues north of the hole of entrance, yes.
Why would that be?
That's one of those phenomena you don't know what occurs when you fire this weapon an 1 3/4 inches, how it throws that powder out of the muzzle.
Just shows the uncertainty of the analysis?
That's correct.
In number two, will you agree with me, it's the same way, there's more stippling kind of north of this entry point?
There's more deposits there, yes, sir.
Okay. Number four, the same way?
Yes, sir.
So even looking at, in a test that was being done where the gun was stationary and pointed at under a controlled situation in a lab, then you still have these variables in their own testing, don't you?
It certainly indicates that.
And again, number five, it's, we got the same issue up here, don't we? Way up here.
Yes, sir. If they fired everything perpendicular to the target.
If they fired everything perpendicular to the target.
That's correct.
So if you're running a test to make a distance determination, then wouldn't you want to have it fired perpendicular so that they could be able to make their distance determination and you could as well?
That's correct, yes.
So you wouldn't want to have it at some sort of angle or some sort of variation in the process where you might have abnormalities that would create a pattern, a stippling pattern that was that would not be consistent to a perpendicular shot right at the cotton twill from certain distances, correct?
That's correct, sir.
Well, tell us what you did in terms of making your determination about what you think the appropriate, your analysis or conclusion based upon the examination of the photograph of Mrs. Ward's face to the cotton twilling patterns that are in Government's 42. What did you do?
Well, I did my comparison with this would be the known, and the wound on the material deposited upon the victim's face would be the unknown. And comparing those two and measuring the heights and then looking at the density, one can make a determination approximate muzzle to victim distance.
Well, as it relates to your analysis about comparing on the distances between the photographs of Mrs. Ward's face and the cotton twillings, what was your analysis and what were your findings?
My findings, it's in my opinion that based upon the tests that they have produced, FDLE lab, and the pattern on the face of the victim, it was fired at a distance greater than 6 inches and not greater than 18 inches, with the 12-inch pattern more closely to the representing the pattern on the face of the victim.
Okay. And this is after you had examined the cotton twillings with a magnifying glass?
Yes, sir.
That's all I have, Your Honor.
Cross.
Morning, Mr. Stiers.
Morning, Counselor.
You said that this 357 Magnum ammunition, it's high speed.
It's got high velocity, yes, sir.
All right, so there is a technical difference between speed and velocity, right?
Yes, there is.
Velocity implies directionality.
What's that again?
Velocity would imply directionality. Speed doesn't. Never mind. All right, so how fast do these 357 Magnum cartridges expel a projectile?
It depends what bullet weight you're looking at. It can go from 1,600 feet per second to 1,900 feet per second.
All right, and about how many cubic feet of air is produced from the average cartridge when the explosion goes off?
I don't know that.
Okay. Now, you examined the victim's, the pattern stippling on the victim's face, correct?
Yes, sir.
Isn't it fair to say that the pattern might have been a little wider than her face.
It could have been
Okay.
wider, yes, sir.
And you examined all the twill cloths at 6, 12, 18, 24, and 30, correct?
Yes, sir.
And there was 3 of each with store-bought or not ammunition from the firearm, correct?
Yes, sir.
And then there was, at 12 inches and 18 inches, 1 additional round fired with a round found in the weapon, as far as you know.
Yes, sir.
All right. And obviously, you know, the bigger the sample size, the better, because there is some variability in these things, correct?
Yes, sir.
And if there's only 5 rounds in the firearm, obviously there's some limitations on how many rounds we can use if one has already been spent, correct?
That's true.
And even if it's the same rounds from the same firearm, there's some variability within each cartridge too, correct?
That's correct.
All right, so this is an approximation, but it's an expert approximation based on your expertise, correct?
Yes, sir.
And with the 18-inch cloth twill pattern that was used with actual ammunition, what was the relationship between that and comparing that to Mrs. Ward's face?
Which round was you talking about?
The 18 inches,
Yes.
and it might have been called K4 or number 4, the one that was said to be from the actual ammunition.
Yes.
What was the relationship?
It had a larger height of 7 inches, and it was a moderate type pattern.
Was it similar?
It was similar.
Okay. And there is that inverse relationship between pattern density and diameter, correct?
Yes.
Right. And so is it fair to say that the 4 shots at 12 inches and that 1 shot with the actual ammunition at 18 are the most fair approximation and bracketing of the distance?
It's one you can use, but I'd like to have more fired at using the same ammunition that was in the gun at 12 inches and also 18 inches.
I would like to have more too, but the question is, the 4 shots at 12 inches and the 1 at 18 inches with the actual ammunition is the most similar to Mrs. Ward's pattern, correct?
That's correct, sir. Okay. Well, the one with the 7-inch, one with the 18-inch had a 7-inch height, whereas on her face I measured at 6 inches.
But the pattern density was similar.
It was similar to the pattern density.
Okay. No other questions?
Redirect.
Well, Mr. Sires, they also had a firing from a bullet that was in the chamber of the gun at 12 inches as well, correct?
Yes, sir.
And it is still your opinion that the 12-inch distance is the appropriate distance that you think is more appropriate within that bracket?
It's my opinion, it's more closely to the 12-inch.
Okay. So your opinion would be greater than 6 inches, less than 18, but more appropriately 12 inches.
That's correct.
That's all I have, Your Honor.
May this witness be excused.
May I have one moment to see if there's one recross question on that?
You may.
Thank you. No questions.
All right, thank you, sir. You're free to go.
Thank you.
Call your next witness.
Defense call Stuart James.
You may inquire.
Thank you, Your Honor. Morning, sir.
Good morning.
Would you please state your name?
Yes, my name is Stuart, spelled S-T-U-A-R-T. Middle initial is H, and my last name is James, J-A-M-E-S.
What is your occupation?
I am a forensic scientist. I have a concentration in bloodstain pattern analysis, which is a study of the size, shape, and distribution of bloodstains when they are present at a scene of bloodshed.
Okay. Can you give the jury the benefit of your educational background?
Yes, I can.
Please do.
Yes, I received a BA degree in biology and chemistry from Hobart College in upstate New York back in 1962. I received a medical technology degree after a one-year internship at St. Mary's Hospital in Tucson, Arizona. And for several years, I was a medical technologist in various hospitals performing various types of clinical testing on blood and urine and often other body tissues. My education continued with some graduate level courses that I took at Elmira College, which is also in upstate New York. Those courses included forensic microscopy, homicide investigation, as well as my first basic course in bloodstain pattern analysis. And since that time, I would estimate probably at least 400 hours of continuing education in death investigation and bloodstain pattern analysis.
As part of your job and your work, do you do training?
Yes, I do a lot of training in both basic and advanced courses in bloodstain pattern analysis. I've conducted these courses many times with a Paul Kish from Corning, New York, and we have taught together pretty much throughout the United States and in several European countries such as the UK, the Netherlands, and I've also taught a lot of courses with Anna Cox from Tampa, Florida, and we've taught basically around the state of Florida, basic and advanced courses.
Mr. James, what is a scientific working group?
A scientific working group was a concept of the FBI back about 12 years ago, or maybe 14 years now. And what they did, they set up working groups in various forensic disciplines, such as pathology, trace evidence, drugs and toxicology, as well as bloodstain pattern analysis. And it was called SWIGSTAIN, the Scientific Working Group on Bloodstain Pattern Analysis, which I was a member of this group of about 35 folks from around the world to try to upgrade the discipline of our bloodstain pattern analysis and encourage research and make the terminology uniform and make this the basis for our conclusions more scientific in nature.
As part of your work, are you the editor, or have you edited any journals?
Yes, I was, for 12 years, I was the editor of our organization publication, which started off as the IABP News, which is International Association of Bloodstain Pattern Analysis. And that turned into a journal, and I stepped down from that position last year. And
do you hold any I think you said that was called the International Association of Bloodstain Pattern Analysis?
That's correct. That organization was started, I'm a founding member of it in 1983, and we have annual conferences, training sessions every year. At this point in my career, I'm also the historian of that group, as well as a distinguished member. And it's primarily a group for about 900 individuals from around the world, internationally, who spend a lot of time on bloodstain pattern analysis, and it's an ongoing training institute.
As part of your career or profession, do you testify in court?
I do.
Okay. How many times would you say you've testified in court?
Well, going back when I was a supervisor of the forensic laboratory in upstate New York, and now through my consulting career, which has been in progress since 1988, probably about 300 or 400 times at least.
And how many jurisdictions?
I have, let's see, I've consulted in 47 states and testified in approximately 35 of those.
Now, do you testify just for defense lawyers?
No, no, well, let's go back to when I'm consulted, either by prosecution lawyers or defense lawyers, I will work on the case, and if there's something that can be said scientifically in court, then I would testify in many cases. Probably 25% now for the prosecution and about 75% for defense attorneys.
Were you asked to review some materials involving this case, involving Bob Ward?
Yes, I was.
Okay. In fact, did you have an opportunity to go to the Ward home shortly after the September 21st, 2009 incident?
I did. That date would have been, or was, October 3rd of 2009.
When you went to the Ward home, was the crime scene in a similar condition than it was on September 21st, 2009?
Well, no, because the crime scene unit had been there prior to my arrival, and of course the body was gone, and there were certain items that had been collected.
Some of the carpet had been taken,
Yes.
and the body had been removed.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Beside that, were the blood stains still on the wall?
Oh, yes, there were bloodstains in several places.
Okay. Did you have an opportunity to examine the entire master bedroom?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
I
You're
also, well,
Pardon?
in terms of examining the entire bedroom, I also had the opportunity to examine photographs of the scene of the bedroom that were taken by the Sheriff's Department.
And while we're on that, you also had the opportunity to actually go down to the Sheriff's Department and look at the evidence that had been taken from the home.
That is correct. That was performed on, let's see. Yeah, that was later on. That was February 17th of 2010.
Okay. Let's go back to the master bedroom for one moment, if we could, sir. Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
You may.
Thank you. Approaching the witness, which is with what's been marked as Defense Exhibit 1. Mr. James, do you recognize this?
Would you hold up a little?
Sure.
Yes.
Okay. Is this a fair and accurate representation of the Ward bedroom on the day you were there?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Your Honor, we'd move Defense 1.
Any objections?
No objection.
All right, this will be received without objection as Defense Exhibit number 1.
Your Honor, may the witness step down to go over the exhibit with the jury?
You may.
May I?
You can step down. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Is there an easel?
That's what I was just going to ask the deputy.
Gotcha. Okay.
There's one right behind you, Ken.
Why don't you come right here first, and then let me get the easel and the microphone, and then we're cooking with gas. Well, maybe I'll just hold it.
Is there a problem with these?
I just don't see where I put the out.
There should be one behind it. Is that the only one we have?
I think that's it.
No, there's another.
I can serve as the easel.
We have another one. She's getting it.
Okay.
This working?
Yeah. Give the deputy a second. We'll get an easel in here.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Thank you, Deputy. Okay. Mr. James, if you could just tell me what this is and where this is.
Yes, this is the master bedroom of the residence of Mr. and Mrs. Ward.
Okay. What is this large item here in the middle of the bottom portion?
Well, this being the master bedroom, this is the bed, which is enclosed in this like semi-circular area
Okay.
of the room. And
What are these two items right here?
these are two nightstands on the left and right side of the bed. This is a armoire, if I'm saying that correctly,
Okay.
right at the foot of the bed. And you have access to the master bathroom, to a balcony, and of course over here you have windows, like a ledge, and going further you have access to a terrace, and the entrance to the bedroom or the exit, depending on which way you're going, is up in this corner.
Okay. When you encountered the scene, where was the majority of the blood evidence?
Okay. Well, let's get oriented here with north and south, because I'll be referring to that. I believe there was a diagram that I had written north on. I believe north in this diagram is on the upper side,
Okay.
and south would be to the
So,
bottom.
so this is, would this be the area where the event occurred?
Yes, that would be the southwest area, I believe, of the bedroom, between the bed, the nightstand, and the area where the window ledge is.
Okay. And we're going to have pictures of that in a moment that we can see better, but for right now, can you just point to the area where you analyzed the blood on the wall?
Well, the blood on the wall would be in this area just below the window. There were several areas of projected blood stains.
Sure.
Yes, below the window, but, up to the window, but on the portion of the wall below.
Okay. Let's take this down for now and let's look at some pictures. Okay? So if you can go back up. Mr. J, could you put on? Yep. Your Honor, permission to publish photographs from State's Exhibit AN.
Granted.
Okay. Can you see that, Mr. James?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Are you publishing to the jury at this time?
Yes, Your Honor, please.
All right. Hold on, because it isn't up yet. It states what, 18? This is states number 18, and it is up. Go ahead.
Okay. Can you tell us what that picture shows?
Yes, this photograph or image depicts the shoes of Mr. Ward.
Okay. What does the blood pattern on those shoes tell us about this case?
Well, looking at, again, at the size, shape, and distribution of the stains that are located on the top of the front top of the right shoe, we have stains that are primarily coming straight down. And I tell you that because of the relative shape of the stains being nearly circular. And when stains are nearly circular, they're coming down pretty much vertically.
May I back you up for one moment? Whose blood is on that shoe?
The DNA reports indicated it was Mrs. Ward's blood.
Okay, so Mrs. Ward's blood it fell onto Mr. Ward's shoes.
Yes, and it was and spattered. And you see the one stain, which is just to the left there, has kind of a tail to it.
Are you able to draw on the screen? I'm not sure if you
I
can do
don't
that.
mess this up.
May I approach?
You may, just show him how to do it.
Oh, they're going to be the blind leading the blind here.
See the dot at the top, the
Yep.
arrow? Hit the arrow.
It's probably just easy to
Why
describe
don't
it.
you sort of try it? Oh, there you go. Almost.
No, you have to hit that arrow.
I don't know.
Put your finger on it. When the pen appears, that's when he draws on it.
Is it the?
Well,
Is it the?
now it's covered up.
We
Can we,
can clear that.
at least you can see where the stain is, but can you get that dot off of there?
Try. How do we clear this screen, Judge?
See the green arrow
Agree? Yes.
on the top right? Yeah. You should have an option to clear.
Got
At the
it.
bottom where it says clear, there you go.
Okay, that's
That
good,
pen
that's good.
option
Okay.
allows you to draw on the screen.
Now, I've already said that, or testified to the fact that many of these stains are circular, but you see the one that I'm pointing at here that was, a minute ago, had red dots all over it, is elongated. It's got a tail on it, and the reason that it's shaped like that is because the contour of the shoe is raised. It's the instep of the shoe, so the stain hit at an angle because the surface was at an angle. So the tail tells you the direction of travel. So that's why that one stain looks different.
What does the fact that Mrs. Ward's blood is on the top of Mr. Ward's shoes tell us about the scene?
Well, in terms of the source of the blood, and we know through the DNA testing that this was Mrs. Ward's blood, that when it's coming down vertically, then the shoe, the wearer of the shoe, being Mr. Ward, was in close proximity to the source of the bleeding after the shot was fired.
So the blood dripped straight down.
Well, blood dripped and was projected. The smaller spots are more of a projection.
Okay, and that tells you that Mr. Ward was in close proximity to Mrs. Ward when the bullet hit.
No, I didn't say that.
Okay,
I said when to the source of blood.
okay,
Okay, I'm testifying here today about the reconstruction of the case based upon initial bloodshed. Okay, and that occurs almost immediately after a shot.
okay.
But it does not position him at the second of the shot.
Understood. Okay, so when the blood leaves the body, Mr. Ward is in close proximity.
Yes,
Okay,
immediately after the shot is fired.
okay. Could we go to the next, please? Thank you. Okay. Now, back when we were talking about the nightstand and the bed in the corner, is that what you were talking about?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Describe this scene and what it tells us in terms of blood.
Well, in this photograph, we're seeing spattered bloodstains on the white quilt, which is to your left. We're seeing a trail of blood drops and spatters going from the edge of the bottom of the bed, which terminate where the right foot of Mrs. Ward is. And that indicates movement of her from the area closer to the nightstand and the bed towards her final position.
Okay, and how much movement? Do we know?
Just a few feet, as you can see here.
Right. Okay, and is that the place where you believe the event took place?
Yes, between the edge of the bed and the nightstand in that what looks like a void area where there's no blood.
Mr. James, that's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Cross.
All right, good morning, Mr. James. How are you?
Oh, good morning, sir. I'm doing quite well.
Not sure we ever met. So once blood is moving, it'll move in a straight line unless some other force like gravity changes it, right? Or air resistance.
I mean, you're talking about blood going vertically or horizontally?
Either. But it'll go straight unless something affects it like gravity, which might pull it down, right?
Yeah, for example, a falling drop is affected by air resistance, and it's trying to counter gravity.
Right. And the size or the diameter of the blood droplet will affect how much air resistance affects it or not, right?
Well, the volume of the drop, yes.
Okay. And that air resistance, that's what kind of makes blood into a sphere as it's traveling through the air, right?
No, not at all.
Okay, explain that.
The reason that, perhaps the jury doesn't know this, but when a falling drop of liquid, whether it be blood or water or anything, is not teardrop shaped, it's actually spherical shaped, like a ball. And the reason for that has nothing to do with gravity or anything like that. It's got to do with surface tension. The surface tension is a physical phenomenon. It's like having a balloon full of water. The surface tension acts like a skin and keeps the drop of blood near circular.
Right. They like each other more than they like the air. So they bunch up like a sphere.
They're called cohesive forces, yes.
All right. Now, as far as you can tell from the photographs from the scene, that gunshot wound to Mrs. Ward would be the only source of the blood that we're talking about.
Yes, that would be the entrance wound since there was no exit wound, yes.
So there's no other sources of blood from her hands, correct?
No source of blood, no.
Or her forearms, correct?
No.
Or Mr. Ward's hands, correct?
I don't believe there were any other injuries to either party.
Okay. And in fact, in looking at the scene, there was no signs of a struggle as far as overturned furniture or anything being in disarray, correct?
No.
Now, the velocity of a projectile can affect the blood pattern that we see when something like a head gets struck, correct?
That's one of the factors, yes.
All right. Distance from the gun to the head?
Correct.
Now, the head is a special part of the body because in addition to the blood pressure, there's also the skull, which doesn't allow pressure to escape as well as if I got shot like in my forearm. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. And so when a firearm is held close enough to someone, you can get backspatter if their firearm is discharged into them, correct?
Backspatter, the phenomena of backspatter, if I can explain what it is.
Well, let me back it up. Is that related to the gas that is expelled from the firearm in one way?
Yes, but that requires that the gunshot wound be contact.
Okay. All right, and now how about as we back away from contact, what phenomenon is that?
The phenomenon is that there isn't very frequently backspatter.
Okay. And you're familiar with permanent cavity versus temporary cavity?
Yes?
Can that cause some projected patterns?
Yes, and I think in this case it probably did, but it's
Okay.
not. It's not called backspatter.
I understand that. And we'll get to that. But a .357 Magnum is a higher caliber firearm as opposed to other firearms, or are you not familiar?
Well, yes, naturally, a .357 is a more powerful firearm than a .22 and probably a .38 as well.
And it is a higher velocity projectile than other handgun projectiles, generally
Well,
speaking.
I'm no expert on the velocity of individual types of projectiles. It depends on the load, so I really can't address that very, very well.
Okay. And if a gun is dropped, it would go to the ground, correct?
Unless there was an intermediate object, yes.
Right. Okay. And there was no blood on this gun?
I did not see any blood, and there was no blood reported on the gun.
Permission to work with states 18?
Granted. Both screens are up.
All right, Mr. James, we're looking at image ending 594 from States 18. Are you familiar with this image?
Yes, I am.
And I believe you would call this both drip as well as some projected pattern on the carpet?
I think for the most part it's a drip trail, and a drip trail is defined as individual drops of blood falling to a surface with horizontal movement of the source of the blood. And you may have a couple of projected stains there, but then again, we're dealing with carpet, and the variation in the absorption of blood into carpets is variable, so that some of the larger drops may look smaller because they've been absorbed into the fabric. So, but essentially it's a drip trail.
Right. And would you say that towards the top right of the image is the beginning of the drip trail?
Yes, I would say so, based upon the opposite end, which is very close to the body of Mrs. Ward.
Are there any voids in this drip pattern?
Nothing I would consider a void, no. Just a variation in a little bit of directionality. It kind of curves around a little bit, but I would not consider it a void there.
So then nothing would have blocked or been between the projection of the blood pattern and the drip pattern that we see at any point, or else there would be a void, correct?
Well, not in that particular drip trail, no. That's correct.
Turning to image 591, also on States 18, is this another perspective of that primarily drip pattern?
Yes, it is.
And so the source of that projected or drip pattern had to have been facing that, correct, to make it?
Yes, the source of blood was above, yes.
And then ultimately, we're talking about in this area, can you see that?
Yes.
Ultimately, that source of the blood pattern also creates what we see on the wall underneath the window, correct?
Yes, but that pattern was created
Differently.
After that pattern we're talking about.
All right. And so is it fair to say the pattern goes from right to the left to the wall?
Yeah, but it's kind of a different pattern on the wall. It's a projected pattern, but much larger volume.
And the source of that blood pattern had to have been facing everywhere that there's dripped or projected blood, correct?
Either facing down or, to the side toward the window, because that blood is coming out of the entrance wound primarily of Mrs. Ward.
And so given that she's the source of the drip pattern along the carpet and then that projected pattern under the window, in this image, she was not facing the nightstand, correct?
No.
And the defendant, he had some projected blood on his shorts. Is that fair?
Yes, several spots of blood on the, I believe on the right of his shorts.
And I'm looking at image 323 on States 18. That blood pattern on his shorts isn't readily apparent looking at his shorts from a normal distance, correct? Because they're so small?
Well, they're small, but they're not visible in this photograph.
Okay. And there was a projected pattern on the comforter there as well, correct?
Correct.
And is there any relationship that you can say about the projected pattern appearance on his shorts and the projected pattern on the comforter?
Other than that there were more of the pattern on the comforter than it was on the shorts.
And the pattern on his shorts is inconsistent with that projection on the wall, correct?
Well, only to the extent that it's not the same number of stains.
Okay.
In other words, the shorts could have been on the edge of that pattern and just picked up a few stains. So that's all I can really say.
Okay. And so what you're saying is you're now saying that Mr. Ward could have been somewhere over here to the north of the pattern to pick up some of that spatter that came off the wall?
No. We're talking about the quilt.
Yes.
But you were by the window there. Go back
Right. I
over.
was asking you if the patterns on his shorts is different than that projected pattern under the windowsill.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, it is.
Okay. But it's similar to what was projected on the comforter.
More similar to that than you'll see in pictures of the wall, not similar at all.
And he had the drip pattern on his shoe, right shoe?
Yes.
And some of that's projected, you said, like slightly?
Small spatter, yes.
And there's no void in that drip trail that leads to underneath Mrs. Ward's body, correct?
Not that I could see, no.
So is it fair to say that Mr. Ward's right shorts might actually be the beginning of that projected pattern there next to the comforter?
Well, he wasn't creating the drip pattern. I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, because he has blood on his right shorts, correct?
Yes,
He does not have blood on his left shorts, right?
he did not.
And so then the comforter there also had a pattern similar to what's on his right shorts. So my question is, can we say whether or not Mr. Ward's shoe and Mr. Ward's shorts are the beginning of the projected in the drip pattern?
Yes, they occurred before the drip trail.
Thank you. So we can get some sense of where Mr. Ward was standing as well, correct?
In a general sense, yes.
It's more difficult without back spatter and without a projectile on a wall or something, right?
Well, yes, because there's no way to actually position her, that is Mrs. Ward, precisely because of what you just said. There's no exit wound. If there were an exit wound, you would then have what we call a trajectory. We'd have a path of the projectile through the head, and in many cases, the projectile would be in a wall nearby, and you would have 3 points to actually precisely tell where her head was at the time the shot was discharged. We don't have that information because there was no exit wound. So we deal with what we have.
All right, and so there's no blood on his left shoe either, right?
Not that I recall, no.
Okay. And in the photographs with the measuring tape, there was a photograph with the measuring tape going about 11 inches deep on the top of the bed. Do you recall that image?
Yes,
And so we can say that the projected blood pattern went 11 inches deep onto the bed, plus whatever distance the wound was from the edge of the bed, correct?
yes, approximately, yes.
And in image ending 260 on States 18, we can see the horizontal difference along the comforter of how the pattern's getting sprayed from right to left, correct?
Would you repeat the last part of that question?
The pattern in this image is going from top to bottom, which would be like from the right of the bed to the left of the bed.
Yes.
Okay. And then this image in 266, that shows the measurement as far as the length of the trail coming from the nightstand at the top of the image, correct?
Well, it doesn't actually measure the length of the trail.
Approximately before it tapers off in this image.
Yeah, I believe that, I recognize that measuring tape. I believe, I don't know if it was inches or centimeters, but at any rate, it's only measuring a distance from the trail back toward the nightstand.
Okay. All right, and in this image, 269, measuring the height from the base of the bed up to the top of the mattress?
That's correct.
It's about 27 inches?
It's a little blurry, but if I can just judge, approximately, yes. That's better, okay. 24, 27 and a half, that's good.
And on the bed skirt, the beige thing underneath the white sheet, is that also a blood pattern?
It appears to be, you mean the skirting there?
Yes, the bed skirt?
Yeah, there's some stains that have been produced. You can see the tail coming downwards. Those stains were coming from above and hitting at an angle, and they're like.
So where I'm using the pointer, is that a tail of that pattern up there?
No, I lost my train of thought there. Because we were
particular
talking over each other. I'm sorry. The tail is coming downward, which indicates that it's a drip stain that's hitting at an angle coming from above.
And then as well here, this pattern's a little more like an ellipsis than a circle. Is that indicative of that as well?
Yes, well, all three of those stains are elliptical, and two of them have tails and one doesn't.
Now, is that part of the drip pattern or the projection?
I believe that's drip.
So at some point, the source of that blood had to have been pretty close to the edge of the bed?
Yes. That's correct.
And again, in 278, more images of that. Would you agree?
I would.
Okay. Now back to image ending 176 on states 18. You would agree that some of this blood pattern here is below that 27 inches of the top of the mattress, and some of it's above because the comforter's kind of poofied up.
Yes, the only caution I would put here with this image, that we don't know if that comforter has been moved, because I don't see any blood on the adjoining sheet, so it's possible that that comforter was pulled further up, but I really can't say for sure.
Can you see what my arrow is pointing at?
Yeah, one little spot there. So,
Is that indicative of the comforter probably not being moved in that direction?
well, maybe that portion there, but over on the bottom, it may not be true of that.
Hold on one second, sir. Are you
Sorry.
intending on the jury seeing this?
Oh,
Because they haven't seen any of it now.
I can back it up a little bit, sorry. All right, talking about 176. This is an image of the bedspread over the bed,
For the
correct?
comforter, yes, yes.
All right. And so some of this pattern is below and some of it's higher than the 27-inch threshold of the bed, correct?
That's correct.
And there is some pattern here to the right of the folded over comforter.
Appears to be a single stain, yes.
Okay. Now let's back up a couple. Actually, it was forward. All right. And in 179, we were talking about the drip pattern on the bed skirt, correct?
Yes,
And that's the tadpoling or the more elliptical patterns?
that's correct.
And so that projection that we see on the bed comforter and on Mr. Ward's right short leg, you would agree that that's perhaps a phenomenon from the temporary cavity and the pressure caving back in and exiting the wound?
Yeah, either that or the other possibility is the filling of the sinuses and
Okay.
the pressure buildup.
All right. Image ending 428. Now you would agree with the blood pattern that is on this shoe, blood can't travel through things, correct?
I'm sorry?
Blood can't travel through things, so that didn't actually go through an arm and then somehow land on the shoe, correct?
Go through an arm?
Yes.
Which stain are you referring to?
Any of the stains.
No, there was no impeding intermediate object at all there.
Okay. So Mrs. Ward's arms were not between the projection of the blood from her wound and those shoes, correct?
No.
Because it would have stopped it, right?
Yes.
Nor were Mr. Ward's arms, correct?
Correct.
Or his hands, correct?
Yes, but I should point out that there are two transfer stains there that are a different phenomenon.
And is that
produced by contact with a bloody object. I'm pointing to the one on the edge of the heel, and then the one up just coming down below the laces at about 5 o'clock. Those are two different types of stains.
And can you say where that blood was transferred from?
No.
Can you say whether this was the source that transferred it somewhere else? Was the shoe the thing that transferred it onto something else, or did something transfer it onto the shoe?
No, it's on the shoe. It went to the shoe, yes.
Well, I'm asking, can you tell by looking at the pattern on the shoe, was there a drop on the shoe and then was it rubbed against something and made that mess, or did the shoe rub against something and acquire the blood?
That's possible because if you had a wiping of a wet stain, that's also a transfer stain, but it's not a pristine drop of blood.
Now looking at 434. These drops here, obviously they could not travel through Mrs. Ward's hands, correct?
No, of course not.
Nor her arms, correct?
That's correct.
Or the gun, correct? Okay.
Correct.
521. All of this blood on Mr. Ward's shorts obviously could not have traveled through anything or anyone to get there, correct?
Correct.
Physically
I mean, the
impossible.
best way to say that there was no intermediate object that would have prevented that.
Okay. Image 591. Same question, obviously. Mrs. Ward's hands and arms were not between the projected blood and what we see on the carpet, correct?
That is correct.
Same question here. Obviously, nothing was between the source of the blood and what we see here on 585, correct?
That is correct.
Same for 597?
Yes, that's, again, looking at the drip trail between the edge of the bed and then to the foot of Mrs. Ward.
And as you stated earlier, obviously Mr. Ward wasn't between the source of the blood pattern and this blood pattern on the wall in 633, correct?
That's correct.
Now, did you actually measure the distance from the window here to the edge of the bed?
Did I?
Yeah.
I don't know if I did or not. I'll look at my report. I'm sure it was done by the CSIs at least.
It's fine if you didn't, but is it fair to say that there's some distance there?
Yeah, I'm just looking here.
Okay.
No, I don't see it here, but it's several feet.
And Mrs. Ward, if the source of the bloodshed is her face, her left nostril area, she couldn't have been facing straight down to project it onto that wall, correct?
That is correct.
So, and it's probably impossible to tell exactly what angle, but her head had to be somewhat upright to be able to project that blood onto the wall from where she was dripping on the carpet.
You're talking about just on the carpet now, not the wall.
I'm talking about on the wall. I mean, we know where she's dripping, right, because of the drip pattern.
Yep.
And if she's dripping, then obviously that's almost straight down, right?
Yes.
So she had to have at least been pretty close to upright to still project several feet onto that windowsill, which is about 3 feet, right?
Well, actually, looking at the size, shape, and distribution, I would say that the source of the blood was down close to the level of the windowsill because it's going in at approximately 90 degrees when it strikes the wall. So she was leaned over, probably on her way to her final position, but she was not standing up.
Okay. But her head still had to be facing that direction because
Yeah. Yes, of course.
Okay. But we might have been losing some height.
Yes.
Okay. And so if she was facing that wall enough to project that, she was obviously facing the bed well enough to project 11 inches deep onto the bed as well, correct? Her head couldn't have been face down to project onto the comforter, right?
Yes. I mean, I'm not saying totally erect, but at least in an upright posture with some variation.
Okay. And so it would have been projecting straight out until gravity pulls it down, right?
Or if her head was more down, it would just, continue downward. But gravity would have an effect on it, of course.
Okay. And so if the gun is 12 inches away, up to 18 inches away, we know that there's no blood on the gun, correct?
Yes, there was no blood detected on the gun.
And so kind of the same questions about Mr. Ward's right shoe. I know I asked about Mrs. Ward, but obviously his hands weren't between the projected blood and the shoe, or else there wouldn't have been any blood on the shoe, right?
No, the blood would have been on his hand.
And there was no blood on his hands? Correct?
Correct.
Right hand, right forearm, left forearm, correct?
I've seen all the photos. There were no blood.
And there was no projected blood on Mr. Ward, correct? on his arm.
No, there was not.
No projected blood on his right hand.
No,
Okay. But yet there was projected blood at 11 inches deep onto the comforter, correct?
yes,
Okay. Now, on Mrs. Ward's hands, did you examine the blood spatter on her, or blood patterns on her hands?
I did.
Let's talk about her left hand. There was a large pattern on or about her watch on her left hand. Is that fair?
Yes,
And a possible source of some blood pattern on her forefinger and thumb could have been satellite spatter from that stain by her watch, correct?
yes, that's what I believe I wrote in my report. Yes,
After she had fallen down because she was still projecting blood into the pool?
can't say exactly when that happened.
Okay.
And this is not a static situation. I mean, from the moment of the shot, there's movement. So some of
Understood.
these stains can be produced at different times.
Let's talk about the back of her right hand. There was some blood pattern on the back of her right hand, correct?
It was a drip stain, yes,
It was a drip stain,
yes,
not a projected stain.
no.
Moment. All right, your testimony today is that the pattern on the back of her right hand is dripped?
Yeah, see, you want to show the jury a picture of it so they know what we're talking about, or?
Oh, I'll get to that. May I approach the witness with his deposition, page 43?
You may.
I just want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. I can make that bigger,
Okay.
maybe not that big. Beginning with line 9, can you read that down to yourself? Because perhaps we're talking about the same thing, but we're
No,
not.
we're not.
All right.
That's a different area.
All right, so right thumb, is that better?
Yeah, on the right thumb, there's a wipe stain, yes.
All right. I'm asking about what you're talking about in lines 12 and 13. Where was that?
Well, that's the satellite spatter that we were just talking about that possibly could be backspatter.
Okay. And we're talking about the right hand, right?
I believe so, yes.
All right, so let's back this up a little bit. Your testimony is that on her right hand, where on her right hand is there some possible backspatter, but also it could be explained as satellite spatter?
Backspatter, but then when I looked at the drip stain, I was able to show that the satellite spatter was actually produced by the drip stain, so I eliminated backspatter as a possibility.
May I have a moment, Your Honor?
You may.
Where's the envelope for this? Envelope. Envelope. Going to be using states 45 with the witness. Showing image 73 on states 45 to you.
It's up now. Go ahead.
All right. What are we talking about with this area of pattern that could be backspatter, but you say now is satellite spatter?
Well, first of all, the couple of spots that are at the bottom of the photograph, I'm not even sure that they're blood. This hand had more transfer stains on it, as I recall. There's a little bit of blood, possible blood there, but I don't see the drip stain to associate it with that particular small spot.
Okay. And so these small spots, could that be a limited amount of backspatter?
That could be, yes. That's not the same hand that's got the drip stain on it.
Correct. We're talking about the right hand now. Now I'm going to show you image 100. Now that the hand is cleaned up, you would agree that pattern that we just looked at in the last image is not there, correct?
Right, so that's probably, could be blood, yes.
All right. And if it is back spatter, the way that would get there is by being closer to the source of the blood projection event, correct?
Yes, back spatter, the very tiny mist-like dispersion only travels a couple of feet at most.
No other questions?
Free to write. May this witness be excused. All right, thank you, sir. You're free to go.
Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the lunch break, but I need to ask you a couple of questions before we do that, since I've got some scheduling to do. How many of, tomorrow is both Valentine's Day and Ash Wednesday. Starting with Ash Wednesday, how many of you would like to attend any type of religious ceremony for Ash Wednesday? No one? Okay. And secondly, how many of you had plans for Valentine's Day? How many of you would like me to work late so you can avoid plans for Valentine's Day? Right. So a couple of you had some plans sort of made up for Valentine's Day, and you would need to break by 5, definitely, to get to those. All right. All right. That's what I needed to know. You guys have a good lunch. I'll see you 1:15 in the jury room downstairs. Meet the deputies. Thanks. We'll start back at 1:30. All right, anything we need to discuss before lunch? No? All right. Court's in recess. We'll be back at 1:30.
Your Honor, can
Yes,
I
sir.
bar you on something unrelated?
Yes?